Lucy in silent astonishment.
"You must be surprised," continued Lucy, "because of course he never mentioned it to any of your family. It is a great secret, and none of my relations know of it except Anne. I would never have told you if I had not trusted you completely. And I really thought I ought to explain my behaviour in asking about Mrs. Ferrars. I know Mr. Ferrars will not be displeased when he hears I have told you, because he has the highest opinion in the world of all your family, and looks on you and the other Miss Dashwoods quite as his own sisters."
Eleanor forced herself to speak calmly. "May I ask how long you've been engaged?"
"We've been engaged for 4 years now."
4 years. Eleanor still felt unable to believe it.
"My sister and I often stayed at my uncle's house near Plymouth, here in Devonshire. Edward came to study law there for 4 years, and so we met and became engaged. I was very unwilling to enter into it, as you may imagine, without his mother's approval. But I was too young and loved him too well to be as cautious as I ought to have been. Dear Edward! Look, I carry his picture everywhere with me."
She took from her pocket a small painting and showed it to Eleanor. Eleanor's last doubts of the truth of Lucy's story disappeared as she recognized Edward's face.
"You can't think how I'm suffering," continued Lucy. "Everything is so uncertain, and we see each other so infrequently. I wonder my heart is not broken."
Here she put a hand to her eyes, but Eleanor did not feel sympathetic.
"Sometimes," Lucy added, "I think it would be better for both of us if I broke off the engagement completely."
She looked sharply at her companion.
"But then I cannot bear the thought of making him miserable. And to me, too, he is so very dear. What would you advise me to do, Miss Dashwood?"
"I am afraid I cannot advise you in such a situation. You must decide for yourself."
"Poor Edward! His mother must provide for him one day, but he is so depressed about his future. Did you not think him unhappy when he arrived at Barton recently?"
"Yes," said Eleanor, aware of yet another fact in support of Lucy's story.
"He had been staying with us at my uncle's. It made him so miserable, not being able to stay more than a fortnight and seeing me so upset. He still feels just the same. I heard from him before I left Exeter."
Taking a letter from her pocket, she waved the envelope in Eleanor's direction. Eleanor recognized Edward's writing and finally had to accept that they must be engaged. Her heart sank within her.
"Poor Edward does not even have a picture of me," Lucy went on, "although I have his. But I gave him a lock of my hair in a ring recently, and that was some comfort to him, he said. Perhaps you noticed the ring on his finger?"
"I did," said Eleanor. Her voice was calm, but her calmness hid an unhappiness greater than she had ever felt before. She was shocked, confused, and miserable. Here their conversation ended, and Eleanor was left alone to think. She felt sure that Edward's affection was still hers. He certainly loved her, and had never intentionally deceived her. Unfortunately, he was now tied by an early and foolish engagement to a pretty but insincere, vulgar, and selfish girl whose main interest lay in his future income. Eleanor's tears flowed more for Edward than herself. She had lost her chance of happiness with him, but would only be miserable for a time, while he had nothing at all to look forward to in life. Over the next few days, Eleanor took great care to hide her unhappiness. She was glad to spare her family the shocking news of Edward's secret engagement, as she knew that their affection and sorrow would only add to her misery. At convenient moments, she returned to the subject in quiet conversation with Lucy. She learnt that Lucy was determined to hold Edward to the engagement, and that Lucy was jealous of her because Edward apparently always spoke of her with great admiration. Indeed, what other reason could Lucy have for telling Eleanor her secret, if not to warn her to keep away from Edward? Eleanor realized with great sadness that Edward was not only without affection for his future wife, but that he had not even the chance of being reasonably happy in marriage. Chapter 6. Eleanor and Marianne in London. Mrs. Jennings now began to make plans to return to her house in London, and quite unexpectedly invited the elder Miss Dashwoods to stay with her there. "I've set my heart on it," she said in her comfortable way. "We shall have a very pleasant time together, I know, and if you do not like to go visiting with me, you can always go with one of my daughters. I have had such good luck finding husbands for my girls that I am sure your mother will think me a suitable person to look after you. If I don't get at least one of you married, it won't be my fault." Eleanor was unwilling to accept, as she knew that her mother would miss her and Marianne very much. She was also aware that Edward and the Miss Steeles would be in London at that time, and wished to avoid meeting them. But Marianne's eagerness to see Willoughby, who would most likely be in town by then, gave Mrs. Dashwood an excellent reason for insisting that they should accept Mrs. Jennings' generous invitation, and so it was agreed. During the 3-day journey, Eleanor had plenty of opportunity to compare Marianne's delightful expectations with her own acceptance of a cheerless future. It was clear from Marianne's bright eyes and happy smiles that she depended on finding Willoughby in London, and Eleanor determined to find out more about his character and intentions. On their arrival at Mrs. Jennings' handsome house, the young ladies were given Charlotte's old room, a large and comfortable apartment. Eleanor immediately sat down to write to her mother, and Marianne also sat down with pen and paper. "I am writing home, Marianne," said Eleanor. "Perhaps you should put off writing for a day or two." "I am not writing to Mamma," replied Marianne quickly. Eleanor realised Marianne must be writing to Willoughby, and thought with pleasure that the fact of their corresponding must mean they were engaged. The letters were finished and sent to the post. During the rest of the evening, Marianne appeared very agitated. She ate almost nothing, and seemed to be anxiously listening to the sound of every carriage. Suddenly, after dinner, there was a knock on the front door, and Marianne jumped up, moving eagerly towards the sitting-room door. She could not help crying, "Oh, Eleanor, it is Willoughby!" and seemed almost ready to throw herself into his arms when Colonel Brandon entered. It was too great a shock to bear with calmness, and she immediately left the room. Eleanor greeted the Colonel. She was particularly sorry that a man so in love with her sister should see that Marianne felt nothing but bitter disappointment in meeting him. He was clearly astonished and concerned to see Marianne leave the room in such a way. "Is your sister ill?" he asked anxiously. Eleanor answered unwillingly that she was, and talked of headaches and overtiredness and anything that could reasonably explain her sister's behaviour. Their conversation continued on more impersonal subjects, until Mrs. Jennings entered the room with all her usual noisy cheerfulness. "Oh, Colonel," said she, "I am so glad to see you, and you see, I have brought 2 young ladies with me. Your friend Miss Marianne is here too. You will not be sorry to hear that. I don't know what you and Mr. Willoughby will do about her, between you. But, Colonel, where have you been since we saw you at Barton Park? Come, let's have no secrets among friends." He replied politely, but gave no real answer, and did not stay long. The ladies all agreed to go to bed early. The next morning Marianne looked happy again. Yesterday's disappointment seemed forgotten in the cheerful expectation of what was to happen that day. They spent the morning shopping in a fashionable part of London with Mrs. Palmer. During this time Marianne was restless and inattentive, always looking out at the street, and wildly impatient to be at home again. As soon as they returned, she ran in eagerly. "Has no letter been left for me?" she asked the servant. "No, miss," he replied. "Are you quite sure? No card, or letter, or note?" "How very strange," she said in a low, disappointed voice. Strange indeed, Eleanor thought worriedly. If Willoughby is in town, why does he not come or write? "Oh, my dear mother, you must be wrong to permit an engagement between a daughter so young and a man so little known to continue in such a doubtful and mysterious manner." For the rest of the day, Marianne seemed agitated, unable to concentrate on anything. When they met at breakfast the next morning, Mrs. Jennings said, "If this sunny weather goes on much longer, Sir John will not want to leave Barton to come to London. It's a sad thing for a sportsman to lose a day's shooting."
"That is true," cried Marianne, suddenly cheerful. "I had not thought of that. This fine weather will keep many sportsmen in the country, but now it is January, it cannot last. I expect we shall have frost soon, and then they will all come to town. Why, it may even freeze tonight." During the next few days, Eleanor was both amused and saddened to see Marianne's newfound interest in the weather. "The wind has changed, has it not, Eleanor? I feel sure it is colder than this morning. I think we shall have a frost tonight." Mrs. Jennings was always very kind to her two young guests. Her domestic arrangements were generous, and her friends were pleasant, if a little dull. Colonel Brandon visited them almost every day. He came to look at Marianne and talk to Eleanor, who saw with concern his continued affection for her sister. About a week after their arrival, they discovered Willoughby's card on the table when they returned from their morning's drive. "Good heavens!" cried Marianne. "He has been here while we were out."
From this moment her mind was never quiet. The expectation of seeing him every hour of the day made her unfit for anything. She insisted on being left at home the next morning when the others went out. When a note was delivered the next day, she stepped quickly forward to take it.
"For me!"
she cried. But it was for Mrs. Jennings, and she was again disappointed. "You are expecting a letter, then?" said Eleanor, unable to keep silent any longer.
"Yes, a little, not much."
There was a short pause. "You have no confidence in me, Marianne?"
"Eleanor, how can you say that? You have confidence in no one."
"Me?" replied Eleanor in some confusion. "Indeed, Marianne, I have nothing to tell."
"Nor I," answered Marianne firmly. "So our situations are alike. Neither of us has anything to tell, you because you communicate nothing, and I because I hide nothing."
And Eleanor, aware that she had promised not to tell Lucy Steele's secret, felt she could not demand greater openness from Marianne than she was herself ready to offer. The next evening was spent at a dance at Lady Middleton's London home. Once Marianne realised Willoughby was not present, she took no interest in any of the guests, and complained that she found dancing too tiring. But worse was yet to come. On their return, Mrs. Jennings told them that Willoughby had been invited, and expressed her surprise that he had not appeared. Marianne looked extremely hurt, and Eleanor decided to write to their mother, asking her to find out the truth from Marianne. Eleanor had only just finished her letter the next morning when Colonel Brandon arrived. Marianne, who hated visitors of any kind except one, left the room before he entered it, and Eleanor found herself alone with him. He sat for a time without saying a word, and then asked her, in an agitated manner, whether he should congratulate her on gaining a brother-in-law. Eleanor was not prepared for such a question, and asked him what he meant. He tried to smile as he continued, "Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is very generally known." "Her own family do not know it," Eleanor answered. Surprised, he said, "I am so sorry. I fear you may think me impolite. I had not supposed any secrecy was intended, as they openly correspond. Just now, when the servant let me in, I saw an envelope in his hand with Mr. Willoughby's address on it in your sister's writing. I came to inquire, but I am afraid I know the answer. Is it impossible for me to... But I would have no chance of succeeding. Tell me, I beg you, that it is all arranged. Then I shall have no choice but to hide my feelings." I am not astonished to hear of their correspondence," replied Eleanor, choosing her words carefully. and I am well aware of the affection they have for each other, although they have not yet informed us of the details of their engagement." He listened silently. "I wish your sister all imaginable happiness, and I hope that Willoughby will try to deserve her," he said in a voice full of feeling, and then rose to leave. In the next few days, Willoughby neither came nor wrote. Marianne was losing hope, becoming depressed, and careless of her appearance. She took no pleasure in dressing for a party she and Eleanor were to attend with Lady Middleton. When they arrived in the hot, crowded room, she sank into a chair, not even looking at the other guests. Eleanor, however, saw Willoughby standing nearby, in conversation with a very elegant young lady. She turned to Marianne, who noticed him at that moment. Her whole face shone with sudden delight, and she would have run to him at once if her sister had not caught hold of her. "Good heavens!" Marianne cried. "He is there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why cannot I speak to him?" "I beg you, be calm," said Eleanor. "Try to hide your feelings." But this was impossible for Marianne. She sat there, her anxiety and impatience written clearly on her face. At last, Willoughby turned round and looked at them both. Marianne jumped up and held out her hand affectionately to him. He came closer and spoke to Eleanor rather than her sister, asking in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood. Marianne blushed deeply and cried, "What is the meaning of this, Willoughby? Will you not shake hands with me?" He could not avoid it then, but he held her hand only for a moment. "I did myself the honour of calling on you last week, when you were unfortunately not at home." "But have you not received my letters?" cried Marianne in the wildest anxiety. "There must be some terrible mistake. Tell me, Willoughby, I beg you, what is the matter?" He looked ashamed, but on catching the eye of the young lady with whom he had been talking, his expression seemed to harden. "Yes," he said, "I had the pleasure of receiving information of your arrival in town, which you were so good as to send me," and turned away to join his friend. Marianne, looking horribly white, was unable to stand, and Eleanor helped her to a chair. Soon Willoughby was seen to leave the party, and as Marianne was clearly unwell, Eleanor asked Lady Middleton to take them home. Nothing was said between the sisters, as Marianne was suffering too much to speak. Eleanor now realised that for Willoughby the attachment was over, and she felt extreme distaste for his manner of ending it. Neither sister slept much that night, and it was still dark when Eleanor was woken by the sound of agitated sobbing. She saw Marianne, only half-dressed, writing as fast as a constant flow of tears would permit her. "Marianne, may I ask—" said Eleanor gently. "No, Eleanor. Ask nothing. You will soon know all." This was said with a sort of desperate calmness, which lasted only as long as she spoke. It seemed probable that she was writing for the last time to Willoughby. The letter was given to a servant, to be delivered by hand, and the sisters went down to breakfast. Soon afterwards a letter arrived from Marianne, who went deathly pale and instantly ran out of the room. Mrs. Jennings laughed comfortably. "Is that a love letter from Willoughby? Well, well, I never saw a young woman so passionately in love in my life. I hope he won't keep her waiting much longer." Eager to know what Willoughby had written, Eleanor hurried to their room. Marianne was lying on her bed, sobbing violently. Eleanor took her sister's hand, kissed her affectionately several times, and burst into tears herself. Marianne, although unable to speak, seemed to feel her sister's loving sympathy, and silently gave her Willoughby's letter to read. "My dear Madam, I have just had the honour of receiving your letter, for which I thank you. I am concerned to find there was anything in my behaviour last night that you did not approve of, and I beg your forgiveness. I shall always remember my former visits to your family with the most grateful pleasure, but I hope I have never given anyone reason to think that I felt more for you than I ever expressed. You will accept that I could never have meant more, when you understand that my affections have long been engaged, and it will not be many weeks before the lady and I are married. I obey your orders to return your letters, and the lock of hair which you so kindly offered me. Your obedient servant, John Willoughby. Eleanor was horrified. She had expected a confession, explanations and reasons, but not expressed in a manner so far from every honourable and gentlemanly feeling. How could Willoughby have written a letter so cruel, so hurtful? It was a relief to her that Marianne had escaped any connection with such a man. She turned to her sister, who now felt able to speak. "Poor Eleanor, how unhappy I make you. I only wish there were anything I could do which might be of comfort to you." "Oh, Eleanor, I am so miserable," said Marianne, before her voice was completely lost in passionate and bitter sobbing. "Calm yourself, dear Marianne. Think of how much more you would have suffered if the discovery of his real character had come at the end of your engagement." "Engagement?" cried Marianne. "There has been no engagement. He has not made or broken any promise to me." "But he told you that he loved you?"
"Yes. No, never absolutely. He never said it in so many words, but every day I read it in his eyes. I felt myself as firmly engaged as if lawyers had written the agreement for us."
Unfortunately, he did not feel the same.
"He did, Eleanor. For weeks and weeks he did. This lock of hair which he says I offered him, he begged and begged me for it on his knees. And now, oh!
Eleanor was quite alarmed for her sister's health, as the violence of her sobbing grew, but she managed to persuade her to take some medicine to calm her restless pain of mind and body. Kind Mrs. Jennings showed real concern when she visited the patient. She had heard that Marianne's rival was a Miss Grey, a young woman with £50,000 a year, and that Willoughby had seriously overspent on his carriages and horses and needed money urgently. Mrs. Jennings had no words hard enough to describe his behaviour. She was sincerely sorry she had joked so often about Marianne's attachment, but, with the return of her natural cheerfulness, hoped that it would all be for the best, because now Marianne could marry Colonel Brandon after all. Chapter 7. The Truth About Willoughby. The next day, Marianne felt just as miserable, and could talk about nothing but Willoughby. With affectionate words, Eleanor encouraged her to talk about her feelings. Marianne was determined to avoid Mrs. Jennings' presence, however. "She cannot feel, Eleanor," she cried. "Her kindness is not sympathy. She is only interested in me because she will enjoy telling her friends all the details of my sad situation." It is unfortunate that many people of excellent intelligence and character, like Marianne, are neither reasonable nor fair. Then something happened after breakfast, which sank Mrs. Jennings still lower in Marianne's opinion. The sisters were in their room when Mrs. Jennings hurried in, holding out a letter in her hand and with a cheerful smile on her face. "Now, my dear," she cried, "I bring you something that I am sure will do you good." At once, Marianne imagined a letter from Willoughby, full of affection and believable explanations, instantly followed by Willoughby himself, who would throw himself passionately at her feet. The work of one moment was destroyed by the next. In front of her eyes was her mother's writing, never unwelcome till then, and in the bitterness of her disappointment she felt she had reached the depths of her suffering. She could not speak, and the tears poured down her face. Mrs. Jennings was not at all aware of what she had done, and with many kind words of sympathy, soon left the Miss Dashwoods to read the letter together. It brought them no comfort, as it expressed Mrs. Dashwood's complete confidence in and affection for Willoughby. Marianne's tears flowed even faster when she thought how shocked and saddened her dear mother would be to hear the news. She was now very eager to return home to Devonshire. Eleanor sat down, with a heavy heart, to write to her mother again, telling her how Willoughby had behaved and asking what they should do. Just then, there was a knock on the front door, and Marianne, looking out of the window, saw Colonel Brandon outside. She hurried away to her room, and Eleanor remained to greet him. He seemed disturbed and unhappy, and asked anxiously after Marianne. "I have come, hoping to find you alone," he said in some confusion, "because my only wish is to give comfort, no, not comfort, to support your sister in this difficult time. My feeling for her, for yourself, for your mother. Will you allow me to prove it by telling you some details of... If I did not consider it useful, I would not bother you." He stopped. "I understand you," said Eleanor. "You have something to say about Mr. Willoughby that will open his character to us. Telling me would be the greatest proof of friendly feeling for Marianne. I beg you, let me hear it immediately." "I must tell you a little about myself first. Perhaps you remember, at Barton Park, when I mentioned a young lady I once knew. She was very like your sister, with an eager mind, a warm heart, and great sensibility. She was a distant cousin of mine, and from our earliest days we played together and loved each other. But at 17 she was married, against her wishes, to my brother. Just before the wedding, she and I planned to run away and get married secretly. But my father discovered the plan and sent me away to join the army. It was an extremely unhappy marriage. My brother did not love or respect her, and spent his time on pleasures most unsuitable for a husband. She was very young, had no friends or family to advise her. I had been sent abroad by then, and my brother's bad example was always with her. I cannot describe the shock I received when I heard, 2 years later, of her divorce. He could not speak for a moment, and when he saw Eleanor's concern and sympathy, took her hand and kissed it gratefully. When I returned to England 3 years later, I began to search for her, but she was no longer with her first seducer, the man for whom she had left her marriage. There was every reason to fear she had left him only to sink deeper into a life of dishonour. After 6 months, however, I did find her, in a debtor's prison. She was so changed, so thin, so ill. She had only a short while to live, so I made sure she was properly looked after, and I was with her in her last moments. He stopped for a moment to control himself, then went on. With a firmer mind and a happier marriage, she could have been everything you will live to see in your sister. She left to my care her little girl Eliza, the child of her first seducer. I sent Eliza to school, and then put her in the care of a very respectable woman living in the country. She is now 17. Imagine my horror when she suddenly disappeared a year ago. For 8 long months I searched and found nothing. You can imagine what I thought and feared, and how I suffered.
"Good heavens!" cried Eleanor. "Could Willoughby—"
The first news of Eliza came in the letter I received at Barton Park, on the morning of our planned excursion to Whitwell. That was why I left so suddenly. Willoughby did not know that I was called away to help someone he had made poor and miserable. But if he had known, would he have cared? No. He had done what no man of feeling would do. He had left the girl whose innocence he had seduced. Left her with no home, no friends, and no money.
"This is beyond everything," cried Eleanor.
Now you understand what he is like. Imagine what I have felt all these weeks, knowing his character, and seeing your sister as fond of him as ever. Who can tell what his intentions were towards your sister? One day she will doubtless feel grateful when she compares her situation with that of my poor Eliza. At least there is no dishonour in your sister's suffering, and every friend of hers must feel concern for her unhappiness and respect for her bravery in bearing it. Eleanor thanked the Colonel warmly for his kind words. "Have you," she continued, "seen Willoughby since you left Barton?" "Yes, once," he replied seriously. "As Eliza had confessed to me the name of her seducer, I accused him of dishonourable behaviour and challenged him to a duel. We met by appointment, but both of us returned unwounded. And my poor Eliza has had the child she was expecting, and now remains in the country." After this the Colonel left, and Eleanor very soon passed on the details of the conversation to her sister. The effect was not quite what she had hoped. Marianne listened attentively, and appeared to accept Willoughby's guilt. She no longer avoided the Colonel when he came to the house, and talked to him in a gentle, pitying voice. But she seemed even more depressed, now that Willoughby's good character had been lost, as well as his heart. Mrs. Dashwood's letter of reply arrived next day. Her disappointment was almost more painful than Marianne's, and her anger even greater than Eleanor's. But she advised them not to shorten their stay with Mrs. Jennings, which had been expected to last 5 or 6 weeks, as a speedy return to Barton would only remind Marianne of former happy times with Willoughby. She also hoped that Eleanor would see more of the Ferrars family, who would soon be arriving in London. Sir John, Mrs. Jennings, and Mrs. Palmer all spoke forcefully about Willoughby, and determined to have nothing to do with him ever again. They talked so much about him, however, that it was a happy relief to Eleanor when Lady Middleton showed only calm and polite unconcern. Whenever the subject was discussed, she would say gently, "It is very shocking indeed." But privately she was already planning to visit Mrs. Willoughby, who would be a woman of elegance and fortune. Mrs. Jennings was disappointed to see that the Colonel did not look more cheerful now that he no longer had a rival for Marianne. There seemed to be a better understanding between the elder Miss Dashwood and the Colonel, and Mrs. Jennings, who had quite forgotten Edward Ferrars, began to think that Eleanor would become Mrs. Brandon. A fortnight after Willoughby's letter had arrived, Eleanor had the painful duty of informing Marianne that he was married. Marianne received the news bravely at first and said nothing, but the tears came later, as wildly and as passionately as before. About this time, Eleanor was sorry to see the Miss Steeles arrive in London, as their presence always gave her pain. Lucy pretended to feel great delight in finding them in town, and Eleanor had to use all her self-control to answer politely. A pleasanter meeting took place a little later, when their brother, John Dashwood, came to visit them at Mrs. Jennings. He inquired after their health and their mother's, and was introduced to Colonel Brandon, who happened to be there. As it was a fine day, he asked Eleanor to take a short walk with him. As soon as they were out of the house, his questions began. "Who is Colonel Brandon? Is he a man of fortune?" "Yes, he has a large house with some land, and I believe about £2,000 a year." "I think, Eleanor, I will soon be congratulating you on making a very respectable marriage. He seems most gentlemanly, and he likes you, I'm sure of it." "He has not the smallest wish to marry me." "You are wrong, Eleanor. A very little effort on your side will catch him. Some of those little encouragements, which ladies can so easily give, will fix him, in spite of the smallness of your fortune. You should try for him. How amusing if Fanny had a brother and I had a sister marrying at the same time." "Is Mr. Edward Ferrars," Eleanor said calmly, "going to marry?" "It is not actually arranged yet, but the lady is Miss Morton, Lord Morton's only daughter, with £30,000 of her own. Edward's mother will most generously allow him £1,000 a year if he marries Miss Morton. I wish we could live so comfortably. I'm afraid our income is not large enough for us to live as we would like." And he shook his head sadly at the thought of his own difficulties. The following week, Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood gave a grand dinner party. The Middletons, Mrs. Jennings, Colonel Brandon, the Miss Dashwoods, and the Miss Steeles were all invited. Eleanor and Lucy both knew that Mrs. Ferrars would be present as well. "Pity me, dear Miss Dashwood," whispered Lucy as they walked up the stairs. "In a moment I shall see the person on whom all my happiness depends, my future mother-in-law." Mrs. Ferrars was a little, thin woman with a disagreeable expression. She was not a woman of many words, but she made it very clear that she strongly disliked Eleanor, and as strongly approved of Lucy. If she knew Lucy's secret, thought Eleanor amused, how she would hate her. She felt almost relieved that she could not now hope to become Edward's wife with such a mother-in-law. The next morning, Eleanor received a visit from Lucy, who had been so delighted by Mrs. Ferrars' welcoming behaviour to her that she felt she simply had to tell her dear friend about it.
"She was so kind to me. Did you not notice it? And your sister-in-law too. What elegant, delightful women they are."
Before Eleanor could bring herself to reply, the door opened and Edward walked in. It was a very difficult moment for the three of them, but Eleanor took control of the situation. Anxious to show that nothing was wrong, she welcomed him in her usual way. Lucy kept silent, watching Eleanor narrowly out of the corner of her eye, while Edward did not know what to say in his confusion and could not keep the conversation going. Soon Eleanor decided bravely to leave the engaged couple alone for a while and went to fetch Marianne. Rushing delightedly into the room, Marianne cried,
"Dear Edward, this is a moment of great happiness,"
and looked lovingly at him and her sister. There was a short silence.
"My dear Edward," Marianne continued, "why did you not come last night to your sister's dinner party? We were all there."
"I had an appointment somewhere else."
"An appointment? But was that so important when such friends wanted to see you?" "Perhaps, Miss Marianne," said Lucy smoothly, "you think young men never keep their appointments or their promises."
Eleanor was very angry, but Marianne just answered, "No, I trust Edward. He is the most thoughtful, unselfish person I have ever met. He would never knowingly hurt anyone, I know." This praise was so unacceptable to Edward that he very soon got up to leave, and Eleanor had every reason to expect that this painful meeting would not be repeated. John and Fanny Dashwood continued to see Eleanor and Marianne at London parties and dances, and John began to wonder about inviting his sisters to stay for a few days. Fanny, however, was astonished at this suggestion. "My love, I would ask them with all my heart if it was possible, but I had just decided to ask the Miss Steeles to stay with us. We can ask your sisters some other year, you know." Mr. Dashwood agreed at once, and Fanny, delighting in her escape and proud of her quick thinking, wrote to invite Lucy and her sister. This made Lucy really happy. Such an opportunity of being near Edward and his family was the most useful thing in the world for her. And when the invitation was shown to Eleanor, she began for the first time to share Lucy's expectations and prepared herself to hear officially of the engagement. Chapter 8. Edward's Engagement. Mrs. Jennings was very busy at this time, as her daughter Charlotte had just had a baby and was clearly in need of a fond mother's advice. She visited Charlotte at least twice a day, and it was at the Palmer's house that she heard a most interesting piece of news. She hurried excitedly back to tell Eleanor. "My dear Miss Dashwood, have you heard? Your sister-in-law is ill, Charlotte's doctor told me. And do you know why? It appears that Edward Ferrars, the young man I used to joke with you about, has been engaged for over a year to Lucy Steele, and no one knew a word of the matter except her sister Anne. Could you have believed such a thing possible? What happened was this. The Miss Steeles are staying with your brother and his wife, as you know. Anne, who is a kind creature but of no great intelligence, thought that there would be no difficulty, as Fanny Dashwood seemed to like Lucy so much, so she told her all about the engagement. Well, your sister-in-law fell onto the floor and started sobbing and screaming so violently that your brother had to send for the doctor. Lucy and Anne were told to pack their bags and leave at once. Of course, the Ferrars family wanted Edward to marry that rich Miss Morton, but I have no pity for them. I cannot bear people who think money or greatness is important. There is no reason why Edward should not marry Lucy. She knows better than anyone how to make the most of everything, and if Edward's mother allowed him £500 a year, they could live comfortably. Mrs. Jennings, to Eleanor's relief, no longer suspected her of having any interest in Edward, but she could talk of nothing else. Eleanor, knowing that Marianne would be fierce in her anger against Edward, was now anxious to tell her sister the truth, and to prepare her to hear the subject discussed. Marianne listened to Eleanor's story with horror, and cried without stopping. For some time, Edward seemed a second Willoughby to her. She could not understand his behaviour, or accept that he could feel affection for such a person as Lucy. "How long have you known this, Eleanor?" she asked. 4 months. Lucy told me of her engagement at Barton, and I promised to keep it secret. "What? All the time you were looking after me in my misery, this has been on your heart. How could you bear it?" "By feeling that I was doing my duty. I had to keep Lucy's secret, and I did not want to worry my family and friends." 4 months! And yet you loved him. "Yes, but I loved my family too, and I was glad to spare them the sorrow of knowing how I felt. Now I no longer feel unhappy. I do not consider Edward has behaved badly in any way, and I wish him every happiness. He will always do his duty, and Lucy does not lack sense. They will marry, and time will teach him to forget that he ever thought another woman better than her." "If such is your way of thinking, your self-control is perhaps a little less to be wondered at. I understand it better." "I know you do not suppose I have ever felt much, but Marianne, for 4 months I have had all this on my mind, and been unable to speak of it to a single creature. I was told about it by the person whose early engagement destroyed my hopes of happiness. She saw me as a rival, and was delighted to see me defeated. I have had to listen to her talking about Edward again and again. I have had to pretend to show no interest in him. I have had to bear the unkindness of his sister and the rudeness of his mother, without enjoying any of the advantages of an attachment to him. I know now that I shall be divided from Edward forever. If you can ever think me capable of feeling Marianne, surely you may suppose that I have suffered now." These words went straight to Marianne's heart. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "you have made me hate myself forever. How unkind I have been to you, you who have been my only comfort." And the two sisters fell sobbing into each other's arms. Marianne was so sorry she had misjudged her sister that she promised to do anything Eleanor wanted: to discuss the engagement in public without bitterness, to meet Lucy without showing any dislike, and even to talk to Edward himself, if chance brought them together, with her usual friendliness. The next morning brought a test of her self-control, when John Dashwood came to visit Mrs. Jennings and his sisters. "You have heard, I suppose," said he with a most